Enver Hoxha. Theory and Practice of the Revolution. July 7, 1977. 1. In his brilliant works about imperialism V.I. Lenin arrived at the conclusion that imperialism is a perishing and dying capitalism, the last stadium of capitalism and the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. In the analysis of the specific characteristics of imperialism he wrote, quote, "All this makes the state of development of capitalism which has been reached up to now into the era of the proletarian socialist revolution. This era has begun and part of this agenda of the present epoch is the multilateral immediate preparation of the proletariat for the conquest of political power in order to effect those economic and political measures which form the core of the socialist revolution." Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 24, page 420, German edition. In defining the present epoch Lenin based himself on class criteria. He emphasized that it is important to consider which class stands in the center of this or that epoch and defines its essential content, the main direction of its development, the most important characteristics of the historic situation in the specific epoch, etc. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 21, page 134, German edition, defining the fundamental content of the new historic epoch as the epoch of imperialism and proletarian revolutions. Lenin remained consistently loyal to the teachings of Marx about the historic mission of the proletariat as the new social force which will carry out the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist society of oppression and exploitation and build the new society, the classless communist society. The Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels in their appeal, "Proletarians of all countries, unite," was published in order to announce that the basic contradiction of human society was now the basic contradiction between labor and capital and that the proletariat was chosen to solve this contradiction through revolution. By his analysis of imperialism Lenin showed that the contradictions of the capitalist society had sharpened to the utmost and that the world had entered the epoch of the proletarian revolution and the triumph of socialism. The Great Socialist October Revolution confirmed this brilliant conclusion by Marx and Lenin in practice. Even after Lenin's death the communist world movement resolutely adhered to his teachings about the present epoch, it adhered to his revolutionary strategy. The triumph of the socialist revolution in several further countries proved that the Leninist thesis of the present epoch as epoch of transition from capitalism to socialism mirrors the basic clause of the development of today's human society. The downfall of the colonial system, the achievement of political independence by the overwhelming majority of the countries of Asia, Africa and more are a further affirmation of the Leninist theory of the our epoch and the revolution. The fact that the teachings of Marxism-Leninism and the revolution were betrayed in the Soviet Union and a number of former socialist countries does not alter the Leninist thesis on the character of the present epoch in the least, because this is nothing but a turn and twist on the way to the inevitable victory of socialism over capitalism on the global scale. The Albanian Party of Labour has always consistently upheld these Marxist-Leninist conclusions. Comrade Enver Hoxha said, "On a daily basis the main features of our epoch are sharpened and appear more and more clearly as the epoch of transition from capitalism to socialism, the struggle of two opposed social systems, as the epoch of the proletarian and national liberation revolutions, the downfall of imperialism and the liquidation of the colonial system, as the epoch of the triumph of socialism and communism on a global scale." Enver Hoxha, report to the Fifth Party Congress of the PLA. The Marxist-Leninists always based the definition of the present epoch in the revolutionary strategy on the analysis of the great social contradictions which characterize this epoch. Which contradictions are these? After the triumph of the socialist revolution in Russia, Lenin and Stalin were speaking about four contradictions: the contradiction between the two opposed systems, the socialist and the capitalist system, the contradiction between capital and labor in the capitalist countries, the contradiction between the oppressed peoples and nations on the one hand and imperialism on the other hand, the contradiction between the imperialist powers. Exactly these contradictions build the objective foundation of the development of today's revolutionary movement, which in their collectivity form the great process of the world revolution in our epoch. The complete current situation worldwide proves that since Lenin's times the contradictions have neither been moderated nor disappeared, but on the contrary, have been further sharpened and have come to the surface like never before. Therefore the knowledge and acknowledgement of these contradictions is the basis for defining a correct revolutionary strategy. The denial of these contradictions, concealing them, ignoring one or another of these contradictions, distorting their true meaning, like the revisionists and the various opportunists do, leads to confusion and disorder within the revolutionary movement and serves as foundation to construct and preach a distorted, pseudo-revolutionary strategy and tactic. 2. Today there is much talk about the division of the world into the so-called first, second and third world, about a non-aligned world, about a world of developing countiers, of the South and the North, etc. Each advocate of these divisions portrays his theory as the most correct strategy which allegedly match the real circumstances and the current international situation. But it is like Comrade Enver Hoxha emphasized at the Seventh Party Congress, quote, all of these terms which refer to the different political powers working in the world today conceal, and don't reveal, the class character of these political powers, the basic contradictions of our epoch, the predominant key problem on the national and international scale today, the grim struggle which is waged between the bourgeois revisionist world on the one hand and socialism, the world proletariat and its natural allies on the other hand. Hoxha, report to the Seventh Party Congress of the PLA, if Marxist-Leninists speak about the world and the different countries and name them, they judge based on the principle of dialectical and historical materialism. They judge above all according to the existing socio-economic order in the different countries, according to the proletarian class criterion. Exactly from this point of view Lenin wrote in the year 1921, so when only one socialist country, Soviet Russia, was existing in the world, today, there are two worlds in the world, the old capitalism which has come to a dead end and will never back down, and the new growing world which is yet very weak but which will become strong and big because it is invincible. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 33, page 132, German edition. J.V. Stalin also stressed in his famous scripture Two Camps already in 1919, the world has definitely and irrevocably split into two camps, the camp of imperialism and the camp of socialism. The struggle between these two camps constitutes the hub of present-day affairs, determines the whole substance of the present home and foreign policies of the leaders of the old and the new worlds. Stalin, Collected Works, Volume 4, page 205, German edition. Our party holds the opinion that we must talk about the socialist world today, too, like Lenin and Stalin did, that the Leninist criterion is always true, like Leninism itself is alive and true. The argument of the theoreticians of the three worlds, the non-aligned world etc., who eliminated the existence of socialism in their schemata by referring to the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union and in some other former socialist countries, to the dissolution of the socialist camp, is completely unfounded. This stands in absolute contrast to the Leninist teachings and the class criterion. The revisionist betrayal, the return of the Soviet Union and a number of former socialist countries to capitalism, the spreading of modern revisionism widely in the international communist and workers' movement and the splitting of this movement were a heavy blow to the cause of revolution and socialism. But this by no means implies that socialism was liquidated as a system and that the criterion of the division of the world into two opposing systems must be changed, that the contradiction between capitalism and socialism no longer exists today. Socialism exists and proceeds in the genuine socialist countries which are loyal to Marxism-Leninism, like the Socialist People's Republic of Albania is. The socialist system which opposes itself to the capitalist system, exists objectively just like the contradiction and the struggle for life and death between it and capitalism exists. By ignoring socialism as a social system, the so-called theory of three worlds ignores the greatest historic victory of the international proletariat, ignores the fundamental contradiction of the time, the contradiction between socialism and capitalism. It is clear that such a theory, which ignores socialism, is anti-Leninist. It leads to the weakening of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the countries where socialism is being built, while calling on the world proletariat not to fight, not to rise in socialist revolution. And this is not surprising. The renunciation of the proletarian class criteria and the evaluation of the situation leads to conclusions which are contrary to the interests of the revolution and the proletariat. As the great and consistent Marxist he was, Lenin frequently analyzed the capitalist world and the balance of power within it in his works. He did this, however, in the service of the revolution, in order to determine the tasks which lay ahead of the proletariat, the tasks of the communist parties, the tasks of the first socialist state, the proletarian, towards the world revolution, and in order to show who were the really allies of the revolution and who were its enemies. Lenin gives us an excellent example in this regard in his theses and reports at the II Congress of the Communist International in the year 1920. Now we have to prove by the practice of the revolutionary parties, emphasizes Lenin, that they have enough consciousness, organization, contacts with the exploited masses, determination and the ability to exploit this crisis for a successful, for a victorious revolution. We came together at this Congress of the Communist International mainly in order to prepare such evidence. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 31, page 215, German edition. The so-called theory of the Three World, however, does not pose a single task for the revolution. On the contrary, it forgets to do so. In the schemata of the three worlds, the basic contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie does not exist. What is also striking about this division of the world is the non-class view of what it calls Third World, the disregarding of classes and class struggle, the global treatment of countries which this theory counts to this world, the regimes which rule there and the different political powers which exist there. This way the contradiction between the oppressed peoples and the reactionary and pro-imperialist powers in their countries. It is common knowledge that a fierce struggle of the freedom-loving peoples for freedom, independence and national sovereignty is led against the old and new colonialism in the countries exploited by imperialism, the countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America. This is a just revolutionary and liberation struggle which enjoys the unreserved support of the Marxist-Leninists, the genuine socialist countries, the world proletariat and all progressive forces. This struggle is and inevitably has to be directed against multiple enemies, against the imperialist exploiters, first and foremost against the two superpowers as the greatest exploiters and world police, the most dangerous enemies of all peoples of the world, against the national reactionary bourgeoisie which is connected by thousands of strings with the foreign imperialism, with this or that superpower, with the international monopolies and which is the enemy of freedom and national independence, against the strong remains of feudalism upon which the foreign imperialists base themselves on and which allies itself with the reactionary bourgeoisie against the people's revolution, against the reactionary and fascist regimes, the agents and defenders of the rule of these three enemies. Therefore it is absurd to claim one only had to struggle against external enemies without at the same time fighting and challenging the inner enemies, the allies and accomplices of imperialism, all those factors which hinder this struggle. Until now there was never a liberation struggle, there was never a national democratic and anti-imperialist revolution which did not have inner enemies, reactionaries and traitors, bought and anti-national elements. One cannot, like the so-called theory of the three worlds does, equal all strata of the bourgeoisie without any exception, including the comprador bourgeoisie, with anti-imperialist forces, with the foundation and the factors which further the struggle against imperialism. To follow this theory means to distract the revolutionary movement from the right way, to desert the revolution halfway, to separate it from the proletarian revolutions in the other countries, to drive the struggle of the peoples and the proletariat of these countries into an anti-Marxist and revisionist way. Marxism-Leninism teaches that the national question always has to be examined subject to the question of the revolution. From this point of view the Marxist-Leninists support each movement which is actually aimed against imperialism and serves the common cause of the proletarian world revolution. We as communists, emphasizes Lenin, have to and will only support the bourgeois liberation movements in the colonial countries when these movements are really revolutionary, when their representatives do not prevent us from educating and organizing the peasantry and the broad masses of the exploited in the revolutionary spirit. But if these conditions are not given, then the communists in these countries have to fight the reformist bourgeoisie to which the heroes of the Second International belong. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 31, page 230, German edition. The preachers of the thesis of the Third World label even more as liberation movement, as the main force in the struggle against imperialism, even the horse trade of the King of Saudi Arabia or of the Shah of Iran with the petroleum monopolies of the USA, their weapon transactions in the amount of billions and billions of dollars with the Pentagon. According to this logic, the oil sheiks, who let the money from their oil flow into Wall Street and the banks of the USA, are fighters against imperialism and advocates of the people's struggle against the imperialist rule. So this means that the U.S. imperialists, who sell their weapons to the reactionary and oppressive regimes of these sheiks, give these weapons the patriotic forces who struggle to drive the imperialists away from the golden sands of Arabia and Persia. The facts prove that today, too, the anti-imperialist and democratic liberating revolution can only be consistent and brought to an end if it is led by the proletariat with its party at the spearhead in alliance with the broad masses and the peasantry and the other anti-imperialist and patriotic forces. Already in 1905 Lenin demonstrated in his book Two Tactics in detail that under the conditions of imperialism the characteristic of the bourgeois democratic revolution consists in the fact that the force which is most interested in furthering the revolution is not the bourgeoisie, which is inconsistent and tends to ally itself with the feudal reactionary forces against the revolutionary impetus of the masses, but the proletariat, which views the bourgeois democratic revolution as an interim stage of the transition to the socialist revolution. The same applies for the current national liberation movements. J. V. Stalin emphasized that after the October Revolution, the era of liberating revolutions in the colonies, the era of the awakening of the proletariat in those countries, the era of its hegemony, has begun. Stalin, Collected Works, Volume 10, page 212, German edition. These Leninist teachings achieve a special value and a special meaning under the current given conditions. Today the two tendencies which Lenin pointed out have deepened and operate with great force in the world. On the one hand, the tendency of the capitalist monopolies which break the national borders and internationalize the economic and political life. On the other hand, the tendency of the different countries to intensify the struggle for national independence. This way, in regard to the first tendency, the connections of the national bourgeoisie with the foreign imperialist capital are not only maintained in many countries liberated from the yoke of colonialism but further increased and extended by a multitude of neo-colonialist forms like the multinational companies, the different economic and financial integrations, etc., etc. This bourgeoisie, which holds the key position in the economic and political life of the country and grows steadily, is a pro-imperialist power and an enemy of the revolutionary and liberation movement. With regard to the other tendency, namely the increase of the national independence towards imperialism in the former colonial countries, it is above all connected to the growth of the proletariat in these countries. This means that more favorable conditions arise for the extensive and consistent realization of the anti-imperialist and democratic revolution, for its leadership by the proletariat and thus its transition to a higher phase, to the struggle for socialism. The Marxist-Leninists do not confuse the burning efforts and wishes of the peoples and the proletariat of the countries of the so-called Third World for liberation, revolution and socialism with the aims and the policies of the comprador and oppressive bourgeoisie of these countries. They know that there are sound progressive currents in the countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America, within the peoples, who will further their revolutionary struggle determined until victory. But speaking about the so-called Third World as main force against imperialism and as main force of the revolution, like the followers of the theory of the three worlds do without making any difference between the genuine anti-imperialist and revolutionary forces and the ruling pro-imperialist, reactionary and fascist forces in a number of developing countries, means to openly abandon the teachings of Marxism-Leninism and to preach typical opportunistic views which cause confusion and disorder among the revolutionary forces. Basically the peoples of these countries, according to the theory of the three worlds, are not allowed to fight, let's say, the bloodthirsty fascist dictatorships of Geisel in Brazil and Pinochet in Chile, Suharto in Indonesia, the Shah of Iran and the King of Jordania, etc., because they all belong to the revolutionary driving force, which turns the wheel of world history. On the contrary, according to this theory, the peoples and revolutionaries had to ally with the reactionary forces and regimes in the Third World and support them, in other words, abandon the revolution. U.S. imperialism, the other capitalist states and Soviet social imperialism have bound the ruling classes of the countries of the so-called Third World to themselves with thousands of strings. Of course these classes, which are dependent on the foreign monopolies and want to prolong their reign over the broad mass of their people, try to create the impression that they have formed a democratic bloc of independent states with the aim to put pressure upon U.S. imperialism and the Soviet social imperialists and thus allegedly prevent interference in the interior affairs of their states. Lenin pointed out towards the communist parties the necessity to constantly expose and denounce every fraud the imperialist powers systematically commit by allegedly creating politically independent states, which are in fact dependent on them economically, financially and in questions of military to the broadest mass of working people of all countries, but especially of the backward countries. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 31, page 138, German edition. The Party of Labour of Albania loyally adheres to these immortal teachings of Lenin. In the evaluation of the policies of the different governments and states, Comrade Enver Hoxha emphasized at the 7th Party Congress of the PLA, the Marxists also base themselves on the standpoint of class, on the attitude which these governments and these countries display towards imperialism and socialism, towards their own people and the reaction. Based on these teachings, the revolutionary movement and the proletariat build their strategy and tactic, find their true allies in the struggle against imperialism, the bourgeoisie and the reaction, and unite with them. The term Third World, non-aligned world or developing countries create the illusion among the broad masses who fight for national and social liberation that a hideout was discovered which protects us from the threats of the superpowers. They conceal the reactionary state of most of these countries, which are in this or that way politically, ideologically or economical identical, bound to the superpowers as well as to their former colonial metropolises and are dependent on both. Hoxha, report to the 7th Party Congress of the PLA, the modern theories about the so-called Third World, the so-called non-aligned world, etc. aim at damning the revolution and defending capitalism, which is not to be hindered while exercising its hegemony but is to practice a few more acceptable forms of ruling the peoples. The so-called Third World and the non-aligned world are as like as two peas in a pod, irrespective of their different names. They let themselves be guided by the same policy and ideology. One group entwines itself with the other so that it is difficult to spot which countries belong to the Third World and what differs them from the non-aligned, and which states belong to the non-aligned and what differs them from the states of the Third World. There are efforts to create yet another group, namely of the so-called developing countries, where the countries of the Third World as well as the non-aligned are lumped together. The authors of this theory conceal the class contradictions as well, preach the given status quo in order not to hurt imperialism, social imperialism and the other imperialist powers by any means, provided they hand out alms for the construction of the economy of the developing countries. According to them, the superpowers have to make some sacrifices, to cough up something for the hungry so that they can somehow manage to live and don't get rebellious. That way, they claim, a compromise will be found. A new international order will be created in which everyone, rich or poor, exploiter or exploited, will live without war, without armament, in harmony, in class peace, in coexistence à la Khrushchev. Exactly because these three inventions have the same content and the same aims, we can notice that there is full harmony among the leaderships, English in the original text, of the non-aligned countries, the Third World and the world of the developing countries. Together they deceive the masses, the proletariat and the peoples by their theories and sermons in order to lead them away from revolutionary struggle. The theory of the three worlds does not only disregard the contradiction between the two opposite social systems, socialism and capitalism, as well as the great contradiction between wage labor and capital, but also does not analyze the other great contradiction, namely the contradiction between the oppressed peoples and world imperialism, which they reduce solely to the contradiction to the two superpowers, indeed even mainly to one of them. This theory totally ignores the contradiction between the oppressed peoples and nations on the one hand and the other imperialist powers. And not only this, the followers of the theory of the three worlds call for an alliance of the third world with these imperialist countries and with U.S. imperialism against Soviet social imperialism. One of the arguments which is given in order to justify the division of the world into three worlds consists of the claim that today the imperialist camp, which existed after World War II and in which American imperialism ruled, has allegedly collapsed and as a result of the uneven development of the different imperialisms ceased to exist. The supporters of this theory claim that today one could no more speak of a single imperialist world, because first of all the Western imperialist powers allegedly rose against the American ruler, and secondly an always increasing fierce rivalry between the two imperialist superpowers, USA and Soviet Union, exists. Since the stage of imperialism, the inter-imperialist contradictions exist as a result of the uneven development of the different capitalist countries. They exist, deepen continuously and depending on the circumstances and conditions. Inter-imperialist alliances, blocs and groups form and dissolve again. This is the ABC of Marxism-Leninism. Lenin proved in detail that this typical characteristic of imperialism, which gives testimony of imperialism as the last stage of capitalism, approaching decay more and more every day, is an objective law. But does this mean that the imperialist world as social system has ceased to exist as a result of these contradictions and is divided into several worlds, that the socio-economic nature of this or that imperialism has changed? By no means. The current factors do not give evidence about a collapse of the imperialist world but about one single imperialist world system which is characterized by the existence of the two great imperialist blocs today, on the one hand the Western imperialist bloc with U.S. imperialism at its head with its inter-imperialist instruments like organisms as NATO, EEC, etc., and on the other hand the bloc of the East under the leadership of Soviet social imperialism with the Warsaw Pact and Comecon as its instruments of expansionist, hegemonic and war policies. In the scheme of the three-world imperialist, capitalist and revisionist countries belong to the so-called Second World, countries which do not feature significant differences in regard to the social order of the two superpowers and are also not different to various countries classified as belonging to the Third World. Indeed, the countries of this world show certain contradictions to both superpowers, but these are contradictions of inter-imperialist character like the contradictions between the two superpowers are, too. In the first instance they are contradictions between such imperialisms like the West German, Japanese, British, French, Canadian, etc. and one or the other superpower as well as between themselves in regard to markets, spheres of influence, regions for capital export and the exploitation of the wealth of others. Of course these contradictions weaken the imperialist world system and are in the interest of the struggle of the proletariat and the peoples. But it is anti-Marxist to equal the contradictions between the different imperialist powers and both superpowers with the struggle of the working masses and the peoples against imperialism and for its destruction. It can happen by no means that the countries of the so-called Second World, in other words, the ruling monopolist bourgeoisie there, become allies of the oppressed peoples and nations in the struggle against the two superpowers and world imperialism. History after World War II shows clearly that these countries supported and still support the aggressive policies and actions of U.S. imperialism like in Korea and in Vietnam, in the Middle East and in Africa, etc. They are ardent defenders of neocolonialism and the old order of inequality in international economic relations. The allies of Soviet social imperialism in the Second World participated together with it in the occupation of Czechoslovakia and are eager advocates of its expansionist policy in the different regions of the earth. The countries of the so-called Second World are the economic and military main support of the aggressive and expansionist alliances of the two superpowers. The supporters of the theory of the three worlds claim that it gives great possibilities for exploitation of inter-imperialist contradictions. The contradictions in the rows of the enemy have to be exploited, but in which way and to what aim? Generally they always have to be exploited for the sake of the revolution, the sake of the peoples and their freedom, for the sake of socialism. Generally the exploitation of the contradictions between the enemies have to lead to the growth and the intensification of the revolutionary and liberation movement and not to its weakening and its downturn. They have to lead to an always more and more active mobilization of the revolutionary powers in the struggle against the enemies, especially against their main enemies, without letting even a single illusion about their character emerge among the peoples. To make the inter-imperialist contradictions absolute, to underestimate the basic contradiction, namely the contradiction between the revolution and the counter-revolution, to make only the exploitation of contradictions within the camp of the enemy the center of the strategy while forgetting the most important point, the strengthening of the revolutionary spirit and the development of the revolutionary movement of the working class and the peoples, to leave the preparation for the revolution aside. All this is in absolute contrast to the teachings of Marxism-Leninism. It is anti-Marxist to preach unity with the allegedly weaker imperialism for the struggle against the stronger one under the pretext of exploiting contradictions, to side with the national bourgeoisie in order to resist the bourgeoisie of another country. Lenin stressed that the tactic of the exploiting of contradictions between the enemies should be used to raise and not to reduce the general level of proletarian class consciousness, the revolutionary spirit, the confidence of the masses in struggle and victory. The Party of Labour of Albania has consistently adhered to these immortal teachings and always consistently adheres to them. In these moments of the great crisis of imperialism and modern revisionism, Comrade Enver Hoxha said, "We have to exploit the great contradiction between the enemies correctly for our sake, for the sake of the socialist states and the peoples rising for the revolution. Have to unmask the enemies constantly and must not be content with the so-called concessions and cooperations the imperialists and revisionists make perforce until they have left the danger behind them to take revenge afterwards. Therefore we have to keep the iron steadily in the fire and forge it constantly." Hoxha, report to the 7th Party Congress of the PLA, by portraying the so-called Second World, to which most capitalist and neo-colonialist countries belong and which presents the main pillar of the two superpowers, as ally of the Third World in the alleged struggle against U.S. imperialism and Soviet social imperialism. The anti-revolutionary and pseudo-imperialist character of the theory of the three worlds becomes evident. It is an anti-revolutionary theory because class truce is preached to the European, Japanese, Canadian and other proletariat which has to struggle against the ruling monopoly of the bourgeoisie and exploitative order in the countries of the Second World, and also the collaboration with the bourgeoisie, meaning an abandonment of the revolution because allegedly this is in the interests of the defense of national independence and of the struggle especially against Soviet social imperialism. Furthermore, it is a pseudo-anti-imperialist theory because it justifies and supports the neo-colonialist and exploitative policies of the imperialist powers of the Second World and calls upon the peoples of Asia, Africa and Latin America not to resist this policy, allegedly for the sake of the struggle against the superpowers. This way, the anti-imperialist struggle of the peoples of the so-called Third World as well as of the so-called Second World is actually weakened and sabotaged. 3. A revolutionary strategy is one which puts central emphasis on the revolution. The strategy and tactics of Leninism, Stalin wrote, constitute the science of leading the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. Stalin, Foundations of Leninism. The Leninist strategy sees the proletarian world revolution as one single process, consisting of several great revolutionary currents of our epoch where the international proletariat is centered. This revolutionary process takes place continuously in countries which are treading the way of genuine socialism as irreconcilable and fierce struggle between the two ways, the socialist and the capitalist way, for the achievement of the complete and final victory of the first over the second, in order to avert the danger of retrogression by counter-revolutionary violence and imperialist aggression or by the bourgeois revisionist peaceful degeneration once and for all. The revolutionaries and peoples of the whole world follow this struggle with lively interest and view it as a vital issue for the sake of the revolution and of socialism on a global scale. They give the socialist countries their whole support and backing against every assault of imperialism at these countries, because in the socialist countries they see a strong basis and a mighty center of the revolution. They see the practical realization of the ideals for which they fight themselves. Lenin's ideas about the necessity and primary importance of help and support from the part of the international proletariat for the country in which the socialist revolution was victorious are immortal. However, this requires at all times that it is a truly socialist country which applies the revolutionary teachings of Marxism-Leninism with utmost strictness and which consistently holds on to proletarian internationalism. In the case that it transforms into a capitalist country and only keep a fake socialist mask, it must not be supported. The revolutionaries and peoples know that the success and the struggle of the socialist countries hit and weaken imperialism, the bourgeoisie and the international reaction, that they are an immediate help and aid for the revolutionary liberation struggle of the working class and the peoples. Lenin and Stalin always saw it as a revolutionary duty of the proletariat of a socialist country not only to make every possible effort to develop socialism in their own country but to wholeheartedly support the revolutionary liberation movement in other countries. Lenin, J.V. Stalin wrote, never regarded the Republic of Soviets as an end in itself. He always looked on it as an essential link for strengthening the revolutionary movement in the countries of the West and the East, an essential link for facilitating the victory of the working people of the whole world over capitalism. Lenin knew that this was the only right conception, both from the international standpoint and from the standpoint of preserving the Republic of Soviets itself. Stalin, on the death of Lenin, exactly because of this, a genuine socialist country cannot integrate itself into such groupings as the so-called Third World or the so-called non-aligned countries where all class boundaries are blurred and which solely serve the goal of diverting the peoples from the path of struggle against imperialism and from the revolution. True and reliable allies of the socialist countries can only be the revolutionary, freedom-loving and progressive forces, the revolutionary movement of the working class and the anti-imperialist movement of oppressed peoples and nations. To preach the division into three worlds, to ignore the fundamental contradictions of our epoch, to call for an alliance of the proletariat with the monopoly bourgeoisie and of the oppressed peoples with the imperialist powers of the so-called Second World is neither for the betterment of the international proletariat nor of the peoples or the socialist countries. It is anti-Leninist. J.V. Stalin stressed, I cannot imagine that there will ever be a case when the interests of our Soviet Republic demand deviations to the right from our brother parties. I cannot imagine that the interests of our republic, which is the basis of the revolutionary proletarian movement of the whole world, would ever demand not a maximum of revolutionary verve and political activity of the Western workers but a decrease of this activity, hindering the revolutionary impetus. Stalin, Collected Works, Volume 8. Page 97, German edition. In the metropolises of capitalism, the process of the proletarian world revolution gets more and more concrete today in the always increasing class struggles of the proletariat and the other working and progressive strata against bourgeois exploitation and oppression, against the attempts of the bourgeoisie to shift the burden of the current crisis of the capitalist world system onto the shoulders of the working class, against the revival of fascism in this or that form, etc. among the working class. With the proletariat at its head, the conviction becomes accepted and will become more accepted each day that the only way out of the crises and other evils of capitalism, the bourgeois exploitation, the fascist violence and the imperialist wars is the socialist revolution and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Live and the facts prove that neither the bourgeoisie nor their declared or disguised lackeys, from the Social Democrats to the modern revisionists, are able to hold up the surging wave of the revolutionary struggle of the masses. The present struggle of the world proletariat, Comrade Enver Hoxha stressed at the 7th Party Congress of the PLA, proves again the basic thesis of Marxism-Leninism that working class and its revolutionary struggle in the bourgeois and revisionist world can suppressed neither by violence nor by demagogy. The objective conditions for the revolution in the developed capitalist nations become more positive with every day. Today in these countries the proletarian revolution is a problem whose solution has to be faced. The Marxist-Leninist parties, which have taken up the banner of the revolution that the revisionists have betrayed and dropped, have rightfully readied themselves for the task and started seriously on the work of preparing the proletariat and its allies for the future revolutionary battles aimed at the downfall of bourgeois order. This revolutionary struggle, which attacks the capitalist and imperialist world order in its strongholds, has the full support of the true socialist countries as well as the revolutionary and peace-loving peoples on the whole world, and must necessarily have them. Today, however, the modern revisionists, the advocates of the theory of the three worlds and the theoreticians of non-alignment, are making an effort by keeping silent about the revolution and its preparations and by upholding the status quo of the capitalist social order. By trying to divert the attention of the proletariat from the revolution, the authors of the theory of the three worlds preach that nowadays the question of the defense of national independence, supposing the danger of aggression from the part of the superpowers, especially from Soviet social imperialism, which they consider to be as archenemy, has taken precedence. The question of defining who, at a given time, is considered to be the archenemy on an international scale is of great importance for the revolutionary movement. Our party, which takes into consideration the course of events and class analysis of the current situation, underlines that U.S. imperialism and Soviet social imperialism, both them superpowers, are today the biggest and the main enemies of the peoples, and as such present the same kind of danger. Hoxha, report to the 7th Party Congress of the PLA. Soviet social imperialism is a brutal, aggressive and expansionist imperialism which practices an exceedingly colonialist and neo-colonialist policy which is based on the power of capital and weapons. This new imperialism is struggling as a rival of U.S. imperialism in order to conquer strategic positions and to extend its clutches to all regions and continents. It excels as a fire extinguisher of the revolution and oppressor of the liberation struggle of the peoples. This does not mean in the least that the other enemy of the peoples of the whole world, namely U.S. imperialism, is less dangerous, although the supporters of the theory of the three worlds say so. By disfiguring the truth and betraying the peoples, they claim that American imperialism is no longer a warmonger, that it is allegedly weakened, that it is in decline, and that it has turned into a frightened mouse, or in other words that U.S. imperialism is gradually becoming more peaceful. This goes so far that they justify even the American military presence in different countries like Germany, Belgium, Italy or Japan, and label it as a factor of military defense. Such views are extremely dangerous to the freedom of the peoples and for the fates of the revolution. Such theses fuel illusions about the aggressive, hegemonistic and expansionist nature of U.S. imperialism as well as Soviet imperialism. The proletariat and the proletarian revolution face the task of overthrowing each single imperialism and especially both imperialist superpowers. Because of its nature, each imperialism is always a furious enemy of the proletarian revolution, and therefore the classification of imperialisms in more or less dangerous kinds is false from the strategic viewpoint of world revolution. Practice has confirmed that both superpowers are to the same degree and at the same level the archenemy of socialism, the liberty and independence of the nations. It is the main force for the defense of the oppressive and exploitative systems, the immediate danger which threatens to pitch humanity into a third world war. The denial of the great truth, the underestimation of the danger of one or another superpower, or worse, the appeal to ally with one superpower against the other bears disastrous consequences and great dangers for the future of the revolution and the freedom of the peoples. Of course it happens and can happen that one or another country is oppressed and threatened by one of the superpowers directly, but this never ever means that the other superpower poses no danger for just this country, and even less that the other superpower has become an enemy of this country. The principle "the enemy of my enemy is my friend" cannot be applied if it is a matter of the two imperialist superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union. These two superpowers are fighting with all means against the revolution and against socialism. They undertake all possible efforts to sabotage the revolution and socialism and suffocate both in blood. The two superpowers are fighting in order to expand their rule and exploitation to different peoples and countries. Experience shows that they attack brutally first in the one region and next in another in order to reach for the peoples with their blood-stained claws, and that they furiously form up for attack so that they can oust each other. As soon as the people of one country succeeds at shaking off the rule of the one superpower, the other immediately approaches. The Middle East and Africa fully confirm this. The other great current of the world revolution in our epoch is the national liberation struggle of the peoples, which is directed against imperialism, neo-colonialism and the colonial remains. The Marxist-Leninists and the world proletariat are solidly united with the national liberation struggles of the oppressed peoples and lend it all of their support because they consider these struggles to be a very important and irreplaceable factor in the development of the revolutionary world process. The Party of Labour of Albania was and always is on the side of the peoples who struggle for freedom and national independence. We are in favor of the unity of the world proletariat and all upright anti-imperialist and progressive forces which thwart the aggressive plans of the imperialist and social imperialist warmongers. The Party of Labour of Albania and the Albanian people who consistently adhere to this line will also in the future not spare any effort and will fight together with the other anti-imperialist and anti-social imperialist peoples, together with all Marxist-Leninist parties, all revolutionaries in the world proletariat, with all progressive humans for the failure of the plans and maneuvers of the enemies and for the triumph of the case of freedom and safety of the peoples. Our country will always be on the side of all the peoples whose freedom and independence are threatened and whose rights are injured. Hoxha, report to the 7th Party Congress of the PLA. Comrade Enver Hoxha expressed this unshakable conviction in the name of the party and the Albanian state in the speech at the People's Assembly for the enactment of our new constitution. Most peoples of the earth, he explained, are making great efforts and they insistently resist the colonial laws and the neo-colonial reign, the old and new rules, practices, conventions and one-sided treaties which have been put up by the bourgeoisie in order to keep up the exploitation of the peoples, the detested differences and discriminations in the international relations. The progressive peoples and the democratic states which cannot accept this state and struggle to achieve national sovereignty over their resources, which struggle to strengthen the political and economic independence and to achieve equality in the international relations have the full solidarity and support of the Albanian people and the Albanian state. Since the time of Lenin, the Marxist-Leninists have always considered the national liberation struggle of the peoples and nations oppressed by imperialism as a strong ally and great reserve of the world revolution of the proletariat. In the countries which have achieved political independence completely or partially, the revolution is in different stages of development and it does not face the same tasks. Among them are countries which are directly facing the proletarian revolution while in many others the tasks of the anti-imperialist, national democratic revolution are in order. But the revolution is in any case an ally and a reserve of the proletarian world revolution as long as it is also directed against the international bourgeoisie and imperialism. But does this mean that such country has to stop at the national democratic phase and that the revolutionaries must not speak about the socialist revolution, must not prepare it out of fear of skipping stages and leaving them out and because somebody might call them blanquists? Lenin already spoke about the necessity of the transformation of the bourgeois democratic revolution into the socialist revolution at a time when the bourgeois democratic revolution was still only budding in these countries. Marx and Engels, while criticizing blanquism, have called neither the revolution in 1848 nor the Paris Commune premature. Marxism-Leninism in no way mistakes the petty bourgeois impatience which leads to skipping stages with the necessity to perpetuate the revolution consistently. Lenin stresses that the revolution in the dependent and colonial countries has to be promoted. Since the time of Lenin great changes have taken place in these countries which haven't been foreseen by him in a brilliant way and in which the Leninist thesis of the revolutionary world process finds its answer. The realization of the proletarian revolution is an universal law and the main trend of our epoch. Both must and will necessarily permeate all countries without exception, among them Indonesia and Chile, Brazil and Zaire, etc., regardless of the question by which stages the proletarian revolution will be accomplished. Disregarding this aim, preaching the preservation of the status quo and theorizing about the necessity not to skip any stages, forgetting the fight against Suharto and Pinochet, Geisel and Mobutu means being neither for the national liberation struggle nor for the national democratic revolution. The proletarian revolution must and will permeate Europe, too. Whoever forgets this perspective, whoever doesn't prepare for this aim but preaches instead that the revolution has shifted to Africa or Asia and that the European proletariat has to ally itself with its reasonable and well-meaning bourgeoisie under the pretext of defending national independence, is someone who takes an anti-Leninist stance and who is not in favor of the defense of the mother country and for the nation's freedom. Whoever forgets that both the Warsaw Treaty and the NATO have to be fought, and that both the Comecon and the EEC have to be rejected, is someone who allies himself with them and becomes their slave. In the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx and Engels wrote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter." This statement by Marx and Engels is topical today, too. Both the temporary defeat which the revolution suffered because of the revisionist betrayal and the economic potential and the military oppressive power which imperialism and social imperialism used to oppose the revolutionary movement and the ideas of communism have not been able and will never be able either to change the course of history and thus to bring the great power of Marxism-Leninism to its knees. Marxism-Leninism is the revolutionary ideology which has penetrated deeply into the consciousness of the proletariat and which has an ever-increasing influence on the broad masses of the peoples seeking liberation. The influence of this theory is so strong that even the bourgeois ideologists have always been forced to reckon with it, and they have never ceased trying to find ways and means to disfigure Marxism-Leninism and to undermine the revolution. The current anti-Leninist theories of the three worlds, the non-alignment, etc., also aim at undermining the revolution, to fight back the struggle against imperialism, especially the American one, to divide the Marxist-Leninist movement in the unity of the proletariat propagated by Marx and Lenin, to create a number of groups of anti-Marxist elements so that fight against the true Marxist-Leninist parties which are loyally stick to Marxism-Leninism and to the revolution. All efforts to analyze the situation in an allegedly new manner which is different from that of Lenin and Stalin and to change the revolutionary strategy which has always been upheld by the Marxist-Leninist movement lead astray, making one take the anti-Marxist path and turning one's back on the struggle against imperialism and revisionism. The loyalty towards Marxism-Leninism, towards the revolutionary strategy of the Marxist-Leninist communist movement, and the fight against all opportunist deviations which the modern revisionists of different color propagate, as well as the revolutionary mobilization of the working class and the peoples against the bourgeoisie and imperialism, as well as the serious preparation for the revolution, are the only true way, indeed the only way towards victory.